Every once in a while, a revolutionary public speaker comes along who changes everything. You're very fortunate in life if you come across at least one such person. Today, I want to tell you one story. No big deal, just one story. The story of possibly the single most iconic speech ever delivered by an entrepreneur, or more accurately, a visionary, an industry leader, and in the eyes of many, a true explorer of hearts and minds. Listening to those first few sentences of this episode, did anything sound familiar? For those of you who have heard Steve Jobs speak, you may have recognized that they are very characteristic. The first comes from a Stanford commencement address delivered by Steve Jobs on 12th of June 2005. And the second was taken from the 2007 Macworld presentation, the original presentation of the iPhone. In his life, Steve Jobs was known for many things. His unique public speaking signature is definitely one of them. After his death, his public speaking legacy, but also his leadership legacy, became so popular that every consultant, every lawyer, every entrepreneur who wanted to demonstrate himself as a true leader would make references to Steve Jobs. In fact, his public speaking signature had many different aspects, starting from the way he dressed on the stage, all the way through the number of adjectives he used in a product launch presentation and the unique design of the product launch presentation itself. Now, the speech I want to talk about today, you probably know this speech, the famous commencement address from Stanford delivered in front of an estimated 23,000 people gathered in the auditorium on that sunny day. What you may not know is the story behind this speech. Originally, according to Walter Isaacson, the biographer of Steve Jobs, Jobs wanted this speech to be written by someone else, by Aaron Sorkin, the screenwriter. So let's jump right into the speech itself. It starts with thank you, and then it goes like this. I'm honored to be here with you today for your commencement from one of the finest universities in the world. Truth be told, I never graduated from college, and this is the closest I've ever gotten to a college graduation. Now you have 3 sentences, but those 3 sentences have at least 5 functions. What are they? Obviously, you start a speech like that, a traditional commencement address with a thank you, so that's what everyone would do probably in the very first words. But then, I'm honored to be here with you for your commencement from one of the finest universities in the world. What is it really? Now, it's the first moment where Steve Jobs reveals his awareness of the audience he's speaking to. What would you expect from a situation like that, a commencement address at one of the finest and most expensive universities in the world? You would expect that here comes the famous, iconic CEO who is about to preach to his audience what they should do to achieve success in life. Instead, what he does is quite the opposite. He starts from a position of humility. He adopts a very humble approach. He says, it's an honor to be here for your commencement from one of the finest universities in the world. Now, that's a very good position to start a speech like that, especially if you have every reason for others to admire your work and your achievements. The second sentence, if you remember, is, I never graduated from college, which is what you would probably describe as an example of intimacy, really. Not an inferiority complex, no doubt, but it's a statement of an intimate revelation saying something quite private. I never graduated from college. Maybe it's a fact that everyone knows about, but it's nevertheless quite intimate, and it establishes the kind of atmosphere that makes it more listenable, if you like. But why does he do that? He does that to establish the right background for his third sentence. To tell you the truth, I never graduated from college, and this is the closest I've ever gotten to a college graduation. So, Summing up, 3 sentences only and at least 5 functions. The structure of the speech is the simplest of all, and he establishes the structure from the very first few lines of the speech. Today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories. No big deal, just 3 stories. Why would he say, no big deal, just 3 stories? Isn't it enough to say, today I'm going to tell you 3 stories, that's story number 1, story number 2, story number 3. Instead, he says, no big deal, just 3 stories. Why? Well, quite possibly it's because he anticipates the audience's psychological reaction, if you like, to such an extent that he wants to calm everyone down. It's going to be short and easy and nice to listen to. No big deal. No big deal is a very informal expression, the kind of expression you would probably not want to use instinctively in a very formal setup like a Stanford commencement address. No big deal, just 3 stories. Now, famously, the structure dividing the speech into 3 parts is as old as the hills. If you study the history of theatre, drama, dramatic arts in general, the division into 3 parts is one possibly of the most frequently used structural divisions in speeches, theatre performances, theatre plays, etc., etc. Now, there is certainly no novelty in dividing any speech into 3 parts, but it's definitely neat and clear and simple. 3 stories. The first story is about connecting the dots, understanding how events and circumstances from the past affect your present and the future. The second story is about love and loss. What more powerful references, love and loss, in the middle of your speech? And then the third story, importantly, perhaps most importantly of all, and symbolically at the same time, is the story of death. Now, death is not one of those subjects you will be too keen to talk about because it has implicit dangers in it. In some cultures, it's really a taboo to talk about death, especially on an optimistic occasion like a commencement ceremony with 23,000 people listening to you after they've just had quite a lot of fun in the usual customary ceremony like the Stanford commencement ceremony. The language Steve Jobs uses in this speech is conversational, extremely simple in fact, very friendly. He tries to adopt the language of his audience, young people's conversational parlance. For instance, when he says, when I popped out in the speech, when I popped out instead of when I was born. But the speech is packed with simple expressions and very simple syntactic structures. Now, even talking about death, a very serious subject, Jobs is extremely careful to counterpoint the speech with elements of humor. He uses other people's quotes to make his audience laugh a little, even when talking about something as serious as death. He uses it very deliberately. He says, when talking about death, for instance, no one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there. And then he says, quoting someone else, if you live each day as if it was your last, someday you will certainly be right. Now, this particular reference is quite important because the way Jobs uses humor when talking about a serious topic is quite reminiscent of the way pauses are used in music as counterpoints to introduce contrasts. So when you talk about a very serious topic and then you prepare through seriousness to introduce something really funny, the humor is all the more powerful if you can achieve that effect. What you may not know or what you may not have heard is the story behind this speech. Originally, Steve Jobs wanted, it was very important for him, so he wanted someone else, someone who he would judge to be a true expert in public speaking to write the speech for him. And according to Walter Isaacson, Steve Jobs' biographer, Jobs wanted this speech to be written by none other than Aaron Sorkin. Sorkin was approached a number of times, according to Isaacson, but kept putting Jobs off. And ultimately, Jobs had to write the speech himself and repeatedly started only 1 week ahead of the event. There are lots and lots of interesting aspects to this speech. I have talked about it on a number of occasions during different training where I've always found it fascinating. Now, the true beauty of this speech is not that it reveals something new or that it has a rhetorical power like the iconic speeches of Dr. King or Jefferson or Lincoln or Winston Churchill. Nothing of the kind, in fact. The beauty of this speech is its structural integrity, first of all, its simplicity, and the fact that it manages to achieve what Steve Jobs was famous for, addressing his audience in simple conversational language, and yet managing to hide a lot of rhetorical devices, rhetorical tricks, weaving those tricks into the speech itself. When the audience listens to the speech, they feel quite natural. They feel it's a really conversational language for a formal speech like that. But the moment you start analyzing it, you discover there is a lot of deliberate, very smart effort behind it. I strongly recommend that you watch it yet again, more carefully, more slowly, and analyze the individual functions and the structural elements of the speech yet again. If you remember the Macworld presentation of the iPhone from 2007, you would have noticed that there is a certain on-stage style characteristic of Steve Jobs. It's not only about the dress code, the turtleneck and the jeans and the shoes, even a characteristic water bottle that he would use on the stage. Interestingly, in terms of the language used, what was very characteristic of Steve Jobs was not only the type of adjectives he would use to describe the company products and the experience it offered in a very broad sense of the word, but the overall experience of watching Jobs deliver the speech. It became so characteristic over the years that it's now part of the company brand. So when Tim Cook took over as the CEO of the company, initially, I'm not sure if you share this impression with me, but when I watched him over the first few presentations, company product launch presentations, he may have felt a little uncomfortable taking over the style, which was so characteristic of Jobs, suddenly using all those adjectives like awesome, fantastic, fabulous on the stage. It wasn't exactly natural for him at first, but since it was part of the company brand, he really had no choice but to take over that part of the legacy. And last but not least, let me leave you with a question, and please leave comments if you like, if you feel you have the answer for this question. Even though Steve Jobs was one of the most fascinating storytellers in the entire business world, in the history of business, this particular speech has something uncharacteristic of him. And that is the fact that throughout the Stanford address, he keeps reading, probably from his notes, from the sheets of paper he brought with him. So my question to you is, why would he do that on an important occasion like that? Why would he read from paper every now and then? That's all for today. See you soon.